Hi class, welcome back to Sports Nutrition. The topic for this week's lesson is called Energy Systems and Exercise. If you're following along in your textbook, this is Chapter 3. Before we get started, I'll just let you know there is a lot of detailed information about the Krebs cycle, glycolysis, electron transport chain, a lot of very complex diagrams. I don't expect you to know all the details of every single chemical reaction. This is an introductory course, so just follow along with the content in my slides and you'll be just fine. The objectives of today's lesson are to define the terms energy, aerobic, and anaerobic, compare and contrast the three energy systems used during exercise, identify the predominant energy system that is used during different types of exercise or sports activities, and to explain the process of aerobic metabolism of carbohydrates, fat, and protein, and the concept of measuring fuel utilization. So I hope you enjoy this lecture. Before we dive into the specifics of this chapter, I thought it'd be helpful just to define some basic definitions. Some of these you can find in Chapter 3. Some of them I just put together on my own because I thought it'd be helpful when we're setting the context of this lesson. So you'll see the term energy a lot in your textbook, and I think when I think of energy, it's most simply defined as the capacity to do work. And certainly when we're exercising or when we're involved in a really competitive, intense event, we are doing work. Our muscles are constantly contracting and relaxing and require that energy in order to be able to perform. Another definition you need to know is aerobic. So aerobic is simply defined as when oxygen is available or present and physical activity is low to moderate. So what's an example of a physical activity where you would be using oxygen? That would be something as simple as just walking or jogging or swimming a longer distance. Anaerobic, on the other hand, is exactly the opposite. So when I hear the term anaerobic, I think that oxygen is not present at all or very limited. Physical activities that kind of rely on this anaerobic energy system is when physical activity is really intense or a competition is extremely intense. A perfect example of that is track and field. Track and field uses a lot of these really fast type performance runs, right? So when you're doing a 100-meter dash, the energy system present then is anaerobic. So at the crux of this chapter, the very beginning, I think one of the most kind of simple concepts to understand is that ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, is really the immediate source of energy in the body for activity and exercise. I have this picture here, which is not in your book, but I thought would be helpful to kind of show you the structure of ATP. As you can see, you have these different kind of backbones, is what I refer to them in the blue and the purple there. So you have ribose, which is actually a sugar, and adenine. And then, more importantly, you have three phosphate groups. So hopefully now this term is starting to make more sense. Tri meaning that there's three, so three phosphate groups. And that's where all of this energy is actually stored. It's in those phosphate groups. So when we use ATP for energy, those bonds or phosphate groups get broken down to ADP, meaning diphosphate. So now you have two instead of three, and energy is released. Well, why would it be released? Because we need to use it. The muscle needs to use it in order to be able to do all of these various tasks that we're kind of, asking it to do, different types of activity. You can find ATP in all cells of the body, most specifically, obviously, your muscle when you're working out or when you're an athlete. The thing I really want you guys to understand is that ATP is kind of constantly turning over, right? Because we're using it for energy, and we have to restore or replenish it, otherwise we fatigue. So how do we do that? Well, in order to kind of get ATP back in its original form, we have to rephosphorylate it from ADP. So remember, we've just broken down ATP to ADP. Now we have to add a phosphate group back. So that kind of series of reactions there is called rephosphorylation, and that's what happens to kind of restore ATP to its original form. And I've kind of just drawn out this really simple not really a diagram, but more of just a summary of the reaction here and what happens. It's actually pretty basic. So you see you have ADP, adenosine diphosphate. Remember, you just broke ATP down, so you have ADP. You're adding that phosphate group back, so that's in the orange circle there, PI, meaning phosphate. And then this reaction actually requires energy in order to make ATP again. So this reaction is actually endergonic because you require the input of energy. The opposite of this would be exergonic reaction, and that's when you're breaking down ATP. So energy is actually released instead of put in. So hopefully that makes sense. When I think about the three main energy systems that we are utilizing during exercise and during even at rest, there are three that I would like for you to focus on for this week. And I've kind of outlined them here in this simple graph. And actually what they all have in common is that they all work to make ATP, right? And in any given sense, actually all of these energy systems are on in certain types of activities or sports. One of those energy systems is a little bit more predominant than the other. However, you can always think of them kind of in the background. They're all three of those are on. They just shift into gear depending on the activity type that you're doing. So the three that we're going to focus on today are creatine phosphate, anaerobic glycolysis, and oxidative phosphorylation. We'll start with the very first one, the creatine phosphate energy system. So creatine phosphate, you'll see me abbreviate it as CRP, and please look for those abbreviations in Moodle and in your quizzes. It's basically another high energy phosphate compound. It's stored in the muscle and other tissues. Basically it exists because when we release energy from creatine phosphate, that can actually be used to restore ATP. If you're wondering where we get creatine in the diet, we do find it in certain food sources, and actually the major food sources are actually beef and fish, so mostly from those high quality sources of protein. You can also get it from dietary supplements. I have this picture here of this white kind of powdery substance. If you've gone to like a general nutrition center or Target or any other kind of sports nutrition store to buy supplements, you may have seen this on the shelf. It's available as creatine monohydrate, and usually it's like this white powder that you can add as a supplement to shakes or soups or gravies or sauces or wherever you can basically mix it into. Interestingly enough, even if you're not getting it from a dietary supplement, we can make creatine. Your liver and your kidneys are pretty unique in that ability. They can synthesize creatine if you have amino acids present, and there's specific ones that we can only make creatine from. That's arginine, glycine, and methionine. So if those are present, then basically we can make creatine. It's very unlikely that your body would not be able to make creatine. Basically, if you were extremely deficient in protein, or if you were starving or extremely malnourished, that might be a rare scenario, but most of the times we can make it. What about vegetarians? So I just told you that beef and fish are the major sources of creatine, and obviously if you're a vegetarian, you might be excluding beef and fish, right? So are there issues with vegetarians having enough creatine through food and through their diets? Usually not. Vegetarians tend to eat on this idea of complementary proteins. So they pair, let's say, rice and beans together, or they pair peanut butter with a whole grain. And the idea behind that is you get different amino acids from different food sources. Sometimes they're a little bit limiting, but again, it's pretty uncommon that vegetarians are missing creatine from their diet. What else do we need to know about this phosphate energy system? It basically phosphorylates ADP, so adenosine diphosphate, into ATP very rapidly. So that's actually an advantage of this system, is it's quick, it's constantly going, it's very rapid. The chemical reaction in order to do this is actually just one step. So again, another advantage, it's not so complicated like some of the other ones we'll talk about in the next few slides here. It's catalyzed by an enzyme, so the more and more you learn about nutrition, all of the macronutrients that are constantly being metabolized in our body, you'll learn that they can be very complex systems, and all of these reactions are catalyzed by enzymes. So the enzyme required for this energy system is creatine kinase, abbreviated as CK. This reaction does not require oxygen, so let's go back to that basic definition. That means this is an anaerobic energy system, and we use this energy system during very high intensity but short duration exercises. So let's pause and think. I just told you guys a mouthful about the creatine phosphate energy system. What types of exercise or sports activities would utilize this system? Let's think for a few seconds here, and then I'll tell you the answer. Okay, so the answer would be actually very high intensity but short duration exercise or sports activities. So for example, think about someone who's involved in track and field but only competing in really short, fast sprint events like a 100-meter dash or a 40-yard sprint even in football. You would be mostly utilizing that creatine phosphate system. Any other activities requiring short, powerful bursts of energy, like slam dunking a basketball when you're playing basketball, or even jumping really high, you'd be utilizing this energy system. Also power activity, so things like weightlifting, something like Olympic weightlifting, certainly those are pretty short bursts of powerful moves that you need to do, and you'd be utilizing creatine phosphate system. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, we'll move on to the second energy system called the anaerobic glycolysis energy system. And this, when I thought about how do I teach you guys this, it is pretty complicated, just like the other systems we are learning about today. But the basic definition I could think of, and you can find this in your book, is it's the process of taking carbohydrates, so carbohydrate, one of those main macronutrients in the body, and you put it through a series of chemical reactions that release energy, right? The idea is we want to get energy, we want to get ATP and then reform ADP, and the final product of this series of chemical reactions is lactic acid. So what do we need to know? As I mentioned, there's a lot of detail in your book. Don't worry about memorizing all of those steps. Like I said, this is a basic course. So what do we need to know? Well, basically, you start with carbohydrates, right? We eat carbohydrates. They get broken down to their most simple form, which is glucose. Glucose, as you know, can be stored in the muscle and liver for later use. We actually store it as glycogen. So in times of need, when we've kind of run out of blood glucose or when our levels are running low, we can utilize that glycogen from our muscle or liver to give us energy. Great. Glycolysis is this process of breaking down glucose through many steps to phosphorylate ADP and form ATP. Remember, main goal, always make ATP. So glycolysis really is just this very complex set of steps and reactions basically to get us to form ATP. Oxygen is actually not required for this reaction to proceed. That's why it's called anaerobic. And you basically start with glucose and you end up with lactate. What is the fate of lactate? Your book actually does a really nice job about talking about some controversy with lactate and how it can be kind of cause acidosis or cause some negative effects in the body. We actually can end up using it for energy. It can go to the muscle and to the liver and to other cells. And actually that's where oxygen would come back in. So when I'm teaching you guys this, yes, primarily a lot of these pathways can be distinguished by presence of oxygen. But in the case of lactate, that's an example where you can have no oxygen present or oxygen present and able for it to go through aerobic metabolism. And then when glycogen is broken down, then we can break that down, and that process is known as glycogenolysis. So you will certainly see those terms in your textbook. Okay, so same question. What types of exercise or sports activities would utilize the anaerobic glycolysis energy system? In this case, it's really high intensity exercise, and it actually becomes the predominant energy system after about 5 to 10 seconds when that first system that I taught you about, creatine phosphate system, kind of reaches its limit, right? So as I started this lecture, I told you all three of these energy systems are pretty much on simultaneously, just that one becomes more predominant during a certain type of activity. So here, once creatine phosphate kind of runs out after a few seconds, this anaerobic glycolysis will kick in. Where does it kick in? Well, in a longer sprint. So again, if you're this track person or just a runner, pretty much like a 400-meter sprint, or even if you're a soccer player. So if you ever watched a soccer game, you can see these players, sometimes they're standing still, they're doing some footwork, they're trying to get the ball back from their competitor, or sometimes they're just intermittently sprinting up and down the field. So that's certainly where this anaerobic glycolysis system would kick in. If you're doing a repeated high force activity, if you were weightlifting and doing a bunch of repetitions, this system would certainly kick in. And if you're a swimmer and just doing really regular kind of repeated intervals, such as 50 to 100 meters, swimming just back and forth, this system would also be predominant. Okay, we'll move on to the last system, the oxidative phosphorylation energy system. This is the third system. And unlike the other two that I've taught you about, this one is actually an aerobic energy system, meaning that it requires oxygen. And what's pretty unique about this system is that it supplies ATP, our energy source, on a continuous basis. That's pretty neat. And a process by which carbs, fat, and protein can be metabolized through a series of reactions to release energy to phosphorylate ATP to ADP. So again, we can use these macronutrients, break those down for energy, and that takes place via the system. It takes place in the mitochondria in 3 major phases. So when I say mitochondria, that's the energy part of the cell. If you want to refer back to a basic cell biology textbook or a biology textbook, you can see that the mitochondria is the small little structure that is really the powerhouse of the cell. So glycolysis is the first phase that actually takes place in the cytoplasm, and then the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain take place in the mitochondria. And if you need to see a good diagram, I recommend figure 3.17 in your textbook. The electron transport chain, maybe you know a little bit about it already, but that's really the last phase, and it's the final electron acceptor, which is oxygen. So that makes it an aerobic energy system. And how much energy or ATP do we get out of this? It really varies. And me, myself, I've always been kind of confused about this because some textbooks say 30, some say 32, or if you're breaking down glycogen, sometimes it's 31 to 33. So the right answer is between 30 and 32, depending on what you read. It may tell you 33 as well, and that's fine. But we know it is actually a range. Okay, so critical thinking again. What types of exercise or sports activities would utilize this oxidative phosphorylation energy system? This is actually unique because it would be used to support you basically at rest and to support low to moderate intense exercise, which I think for everyday people, probably most of us are engaged in this type of exercise, right? If you're not an athlete or someone who's ultra competitive, examples of this would just be going out for a walk, maybe 30 to 60 minutes of walking, jogging at a light pace, or if you're a distance runner. Distance runners go for several miles and miles. So certainly this aerobic kind of oxidative phosphorylation kicks in. If you're a cycler, and especially if you're going long distances, this energy system is used. Or if you're a long distance swimmer or just someone who enjoys doing maybe an aerobics class or dancing, this system would be primarily used. So I created this chart here. This is actually not in your book. I made it myself, but I thought it'd be helpful just kind of as we summarize these 3 energy systems. What do I need to know about them? What's so different if I'm to compare and contrast? So just kind of a broad overview here. Hopefully you've learned that with the creatine phosphate system, it occurs very rapidly, as I mentioned, and that's because there's really just one reaction, one chemical step. It produces 1 ATP per creatine phosphate molecule. It's catalyzed by an enzyme. These are actually all catalyzed by enzymes. There's just different enzymes involved. This one uses the creatine kinase enzyme, CK. It's anaerobic, meaning that we do not need oxygen, and it's the predominant energy system in very high intensity exercise and power events. So think about someone doing that Olympic lift, short bursts of energy there. Anaerobic glycolysis, this is, unlike creatine phosphate, this has many chemical steps and reactions. There's, your book says about 18, there could be even more than 18, but it's about 18. We make 2 ATP for every glucose molecule, or if you're utilizing glycogen and breaking that down, you'd be making 3. The enzyme involved in this series is phosphofructokinase. This is a pretty fast kind of energy system, but not as fast as creatine phosphate. It's anaerobic, no oxygen, and the predominant energy system in high intensity exercise. And finally, oxidative phosphorylation. If you thought anaerobic glycolysis had many steps, oxidative phosphorylation has even more, about 124. So no wonder I'm not making you guys memorize these. There's just way too many. It makes 30 to 32 ATP. There's several enzymes involved. The list goes on and on, so I don't expect you to know the names of these individual enzymes. Just know that there are a lot. This is a slower system. It's aerobic, meaning that oxygen is present, and it's the predominant energy system in low to moderate or endurance exercise, like running a marathon. Okay, so I want you to take a step back and kind of think about these application exercises. I actually did take this one from chapter 3 in your book, and I really want you to critically think about these because you will see things like this pop up in Moodle this week on your quiz and on your practical application question. So I really want you guys to be able to differentiate when these energy systems will kick in and what types of activities would utilize which energy system. So if you look at these examples or sport scenarios, kind of just think about it and determine the utilization of each of the 3 main energy systems during that activity. So is there one energy system that's predominant, or do you think there are multiple? So the first kind of idea here is you have a triathlete. He's completing an Ironman triathlon. So you need to think about that in the context of multiple events, some swimming, some running, some biking, going for a pretty long period of time. So certainly more of an endurance event. Scenario 2, you have an Olympic swimmer who's swimming in a 200-meter freestyle race, so a much shorter event, not endurance at all. And scenario 3, you have a soccer player, he's a midfielder, constantly running back and forth, alternatively playing offense and defense as the teams are changing possession of the ball. So here you have more of this intermittent kind of physical activity, running back and forth. Okay, so that was more just for critical thinking and to get you prepped for your quiz this week. I want to end on understanding a little bit more how fuel is utilized. We've talked a little bit about carbohydrates, but I don't want you to forget about fat and protein because, again, remember there are 3 macronutrients, carbs, fat, and protein, and we can actually utilize fat and protein for energy. So fat is actually metabolized aerobically, so we do need oxygen. And what you need to do in order to use fat for energy is kind of get it out of its storage form, which is triglycerides. Triglycerides are the storage form of fat, and you have to break that down via a process known as lipolysis. So what lipolysis does is basically detaches those 3 fatty acids from the glycerol backbone, which is what a triglyceride is. And then we want to prep them to go into the mitochondria, because that's the powerhouse, like I like to say, of the cell for aerobic metabolism. Before we kind of enter this stage of metabolism, you have to enter the Krebs cycle. In order to do that, you have to form a metabolic intermediate. So the goal is that we need to get these fatty acids to pass through another set of reactions known as beta oxidation. And the goal is really to form this metabolic intermediate known as acetyl-CoA, because that metabolic intermediate can actually enter the Krebs cycle, and then it can be oxidized, and then we get ATP. Interesting point about fat is that we get so much ATP from utilizing fat as energy, 113 ATP to be exact, so much more than we get from carbohydrates. So what about protein? I told you guys, yes, protein can be metabolized aerobically by the oxidation of protein's building blocks, which are amino acids, but it's actually not a preferred source of energy for our bodies because proteins are not stored. We do not store proteins at all. That's unlike carbs and fat. Carbs we can store as glucose in the form of glycogen. Fat we can store, but protein we do not. Protein really exists in our body to help in the structure and function of a lot of things and tissues and enzymes as well. But in times of need, like starvation or anything else, we can break protein down into their amino acid building blocks. And the way you do that is you have to remove nitrogen. If you look at the basic structure of protein, there is a nitrogen group, and we can't really use that nitrogen group, so we have to remove it if we're going to use it for energy. How do we remove that nitrogen group? Well, we have these processes known as transamination or deamination. Transamination will basically help transfer that nitrogen-containing group to somewhere else, whereas deamination will completely remove the nitrogen group, and they actually just end up in your urine, believe it or not. As I've mentioned, this is not a preferred fuel source. We prefer that protein just stays and helps support different tissues in the body, helps support enzymes, and really it rarely exceeds 10% of total energy production. Our body much rather prefers carbohydrates and fat. We use protein, as I mentioned, perhaps in a state of severe starvation or when we're just out of glycogen, when we've used all those carbohydrate stores in our muscle and liver, and perhaps we've already utilized fat. So all that's left is protein. Okay, how can we tell what fuel we're utilizing during exercise? If you're curious and knowing, well, how am I supposed to know if my body is utilizing carbs, protein, or fat? Well, you can actually have this measured. I'm not even sure if we have this here at the University of Minnesota, but I did college at the University of Connecticut, and we had a fantastic sports science program where you can actually hook up an athlete or just a regular person on a treadmill. You'd run and you kind of breathe into this mask. And what it does is it measures the ratio of the amount of carbon dioxide you're expelling from your lungs produced to the oxygen that you're consuming during exercise. And that ratio, also known as the respiratory exchange ratio, will give you an estimate and tell you, are you utilizing fat, or are you utilizing carbs, or are you utilizing a mix of both? So actually that's pretty cool. So if I give you a value on a quiz or in your case study this week, here's pretty much what they mean. So if you got a value of 0.7, that actually means you are utilizing fat predominantly as your fuel source during exercise. So 0.7, fat. If you had an in-between value like 0.85, that means you'd be utilizing a mix of fuel sources, so fat and carbohydrate. If you get a value of 1.0, that means you're primarily using carbohydrates for energy. So it's a very, very useful measurement. If you ever get into grad school one day, or if you're interested in energy experiments, you can see that the RER is actually used quite often. And I have a little disclaimer on this slide just as a reminder, because I really want you guys to remember that carbs and fat really are the preferred fuel source during exercise. And determining which fuel source is predominating really depends on what type of exercise you're doing and what the intensity of the exercise is. So if you're someone who's out for a longer walk, you might be utilizing carbohydrate for most of the time, and then you might be utilizing fat for some of the time. So that is more of a 50-50 scenario. Someone who's distance running or someone who's doing a shorter sprint, your fuel source would switch. So it really depends on the scenario that you are in. I think that is it for this week's lesson. Thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.